The way you view the start of the Civil War, or I should say, the American Civil War, is probably wrong. In fact, it is for most people. Either terribly wrong, slightly wrong, or just moderately wrong. There is a level of wrongness that everybody has, and even my view is probably within that, or view of history is at least slightly wrong for even the most educated historian. No one can get the past right, but we try. However, the start of the American Civil War is almost always oversimplified, made into a tight, neat little package for people to simply look at and enjoy, and then argue about with lost causers, because that's just what we do on the internet nowadays. But there's a lot more nuance to it. I'm not going to be saying some stupid thing like the entire thing was about states' rights, although it kind of was, but not really, and we'll discuss that later and all the memes associated with it. But I do want to discuss it a little bit, and I'll get on to why I'm discussing the Civil War in the first place on a channel called Wolf of 1918, where I'm wearing a World War I German uniform, and I'm most typically associated with World War I and European history after I finish up with everything else. I'm the Wolf of 1918, and in this video on the Civil War of all things, we're going to be discussing the start of the conflict and why our perceptions should probably be adjusted just a little bit. So everyone knows the story of the American Civil War in terms of how it started. If you don't, let me go ahead and give you a quick rundown. Basically, Abraham Lincoln gets elected. A man who was not even put on the ballot in the southern states is now going to hold office. In response to this, several states secede from the Union and create the Confederate States of America, the CSA. After a few months of a secession crisis, the Confederates attack Fort Sumter, a U.S. fort in Confederate waters near a very critical port. And the war kicks off. More states secede from the Union and join the Confederacy, and after 4 years, the war would eventually end with a Union victory, of course. The reasons for secession and the reasons for the war are most often pointed to slavery, and that is correct. It is slavery. The whole reason why the Confederate States existed was because of preserving and expanding the institution of slavery, and that's not anything that should be argued about except for to discuss any other possible reasons that might have been added on. But the way we view it and how we actually connect the dots should be adjusted a little bit. See, there's some nuance that needs to be discussed and needs to be laid out for us to properly understand the war and properly understand the Confederate reasonings for seceding, and then eventually actually taking the risk of war with the Union, which they kind of didn't really want to do in the first place. So, effectively, the best way to look at it is that the Secession Crisis happened because of slavery. The question of the peculiar institution of African slavery. That is why the Secession Crisis started, and that is exclusively why the states began seceding. It's the main reason put in their secession documents. It's the main reason they didn't want Lincoln elected, because he was part of the radical abolitionist party known as Republicans, which hadn't actually held the seat of president until Abraham Lincoln won the election. So that's why they eventually started to secede, because they figured that Abraham Lincoln would break his promise of not touching slavery where it existed and would just start abolishing slavery, which he ended up doing. So they were correct in that assessment. The war started over the question of if a state had the right to secede. See, the secession crisis happened over the question of slavery. The war happened over the right of secession. And that is probably the best way to look at it. The secession reasons were wrong. You should not secede because you want to preserve a morally corrupt institution, which is, in that time period, owning people, specifically people of one particular race, simply because you view that race as inferior, even though the North did at the same time, but that's a whole different other question. And the war itself was over the right to secede, the right of a state to secede from the Union. And that is effectively why a lot of the other states eventually did join the Confederacy. Even though they were slave states, they did join for a couple of them because they were like, hey, we want to keep slaves, but we were going to stick with the Union because we kind of believed Abraham Lincoln. But now that he's actually making diplomatic maneuvers to go to war with the South, we don't really trust him anymore, so we're just going to join the South and hopefully win. And that was sort of their whole reasoning behind it. They still seceded mainly because of slavery, but they fought because of the right to secede from the Union. And that, again, is probably the best way to look at the war. It's very nuanced and very confusing and sort of has that feel of, sorry, there's a bunch of stuff going on out there, and it's very windy. But it almost has a feel of trying to play both sides to try to not make anybody angry. But effectively, that's really what happened. See, when the southern states initially seceded, there wasn't really much going on. Abraham Lincoln wanted to preserve the Union, and he was trying to figure out the best way to do so. Meanwhile, the Confederate government was in chaos. They didn't know what the future looked like. They were kind of excited about, like, oh, we got our own new country. We're sticking the finger to the Union. We're going to preserve slavery. We're going to have dreams of expanding into Mexico and hopefully taking all the rest of the slave states with us. There was these grandiose plans of expansion, of competing with the Union and being able to supersede them, even though their economy was mostly agrarian and reliant on a defunct institution of slavery and owning people as property, which had already been shown to be a improper economic form to, boost your economy, and why the North was so much more economically superior. But that's a whole other subject in of itself that I might discuss later. So what happened? Why did war break out? If they seceded and everything seemed fine. Well, Abraham Lincoln wanted to go to war with the South, but the European powers kind of wanted to keep the whole area there sort of peaceful. On top of that, Abraham Lincoln was dealing with an issue. A lot of states looked at the right of secession as part of the American Constitution. They viewed secession as an undeniable right, and even northern states, which disagreed with slavery and wanted to see it abolished, said that they would side with the South if Abraham Lincoln took an aggressive stance against the states seceding. So Abraham Lincoln was playing with fire. On top of that, it would have angered the European states, who probably would have sided with the South for a number of reasons, from just using it as an excuse to keep America in check and possibly reinstate some more power over them, and just because they were, trying to expand their empires and using it for diplomatic influence over the Americas, which France would attempt to do during the war in Mexico and ultimately fail, and which is why we now have Cinco de Mayo, but that's a completely different subject, and I keep saying that, but I will continue saying that. So the southern states seceded. Abraham Lincoln wants to keep them in the Union and wants to figure out any way he can to either cause the Confederate States to dissolve or create a situation in which the Confederate States take an aggressive maneuver which puts the Union in conflict with the Confederacy in a way that makes the Union look justified in attacking the southern states which seceded. So that's what Abraham Lincoln starts to do. He leaves troops in the different garrisons and forts and federal land in the Confederacy, but unfortunately for him, those troops simply just join the Confederates when the Confederate little militias go to those places to take the munitions. There was, I think, a couple examples of resistance, but it wasn't enough to really justify anything, and there weren't really any deaths involved, so there's not really any substance to the idea that, hey, these guys were going to cause a crisis, which then leads us to Fort Sumter, a fort which was guarding a very important harbor and threatened the legitimacy of the Confederate government. See, at the time, the states were sort of looking to the Confederate government as like, hey, we want to make sure that our interests are protected. We're doing this for our own interests. We are leaving the Union and taking a huge risk and going with you guys because we want to protect ourselves from what they saw as federal overreach. If they're justified in that, obviously morally it was, wrong to protect the idea of slavery, but that's what they were doing. So Abraham Lincoln was like, hey, I'm going to leave this garrison here. It does two things. Either A, the Confederate government does nothing, and they lose faith, and all the other states in the Confederacy lose faith in the Confederate government, and they leave to join the Union again. Because they're like, so the capital of the Confederates, which is in the state where this harbor is being blockaded, basically where this fort is, if they can't protect their own interests, why should we expect them to protect our interests in our states, where there's a lot of issues with, possibly a slave revolt, or possibly the Union trying to get more influence? Why should we just assume that it's going to be a sustainable system in which we won't just be slowly incorporated into the Union and then lose our slaves, lose our property, and be treated as rebels. And so if this situation got out of hand, these states would simply leave and go back to the Union and be welcomed back with open arms, which Lincoln kind of wanted to do in the first place. On the other hand, if they attack the fort, they now give Abraham Lincoln a reason to go to war with the southern states that make it look justified, which keeps the majority of the Union together, keeps foreign intervention out, and now the Confederacy has a war on their hands with the much more industrial North. It's a win-win situation for Lincoln and a lose-lose situation for the Confederate government. Abraham Lincoln was a genius in this regard, and he would continually do this throughout the war. So the Confederate government was in a bind. They want to keep the secession, they want to keep their government safe, but if they don't attack this fort and they stay at peace, all the other states within the Confederate government will lose faith in the Confederacy, and they'll go back to the Union. Or at least one or two states will, which will cause a domino effect, and the entire South will collapse. And at the very, very least, in the best case scenario for the South, they'll merely be a puppet of the United States until they get reincorporated into the Union, effectively. Or they can attack Fort Sumter and pray that the Union doesn't do anything, or that the foreign powers will see their plight and will come to help them. Or they'll get enough states join them and agree with them, and they'll be able to take out the Union and win the war. So they attack Fort Sumter. It was one of those situations where do nothing and die, or do something, the only option, and most likely die. So they had to do something, and they attacked Fort Sumter, giving Lincoln the opportunity to attack the South that he needed in order to preserve the Union. See, Lincoln's entire policy was preserve the Union first, abolish slavery second. He knew the second the Secession Crisis started, he had to put slavery on the back burner and focus on preserving the Union so that he could eventually abolish slavery. Lincoln was a Unionist and an abolitionist, basically the entire platform of the Republican Party at the time. Preserve the Union, abolish slavery. A lot of the Republicans didn't like this because their thing was flipped. Abolish slavery, preserve the Union, which created problems in the Union government, which I can get to in a future video. Right now we're focused on the start of the Civil War. What's funny is that the Confederates actually issued an order to raise troops first right after attacking Sumter, before Lincoln even issued his order. However, Lincoln issuing his order to raise troops, less troops by the way, to attack the South, still angered enough southern states that they would still secede from the Union and join the Confederacy. Now, there were several key slave states that stayed in the Union because they did not agree with the South at all. They were like, hey, we're just going to stick here. And, most of these states didn't have very many slaves. In fact, what's interesting is that there's a couple states that joined the South that didn't have very many slaves and were slave states. And it was mainly because they just thought, hey, they have the right to secede. We're geographically nearby, so it makes sense to join the South. So it's a very interesting situation that unfolded, and it's important to look at it properly in terms of the secession happened because of slavery. The war happened because there was a disagreement on the right of secession, and there was a lot of people in the North who were pro-Union and a lot of people in the South who were pro-secession, if that makes sense. In fact, a lot of the reasons why there was a lot of Northerners who eventually fought for the South is because they saw the right of secession as an undeniable right to a state granted by the Constitution, which is also why people like Robert E. Lee fought for the South. He fought for the South because he was fighting for his state's right to secede, and less so because of slavery, although I'm pretty sure those were part of his motives as well, but not the majority. Yeah, my camera totally didn't just shut off because the memory card was full, and I totally didn't have to wait a while to transfer stuff and then recharge the battery. That totally didn't happen. Anyway, the Civil War is an interesting subject, obviously. And the start of it is often overlooked and oversimplified, and I really hope that this video helped explain some of that in a way that people can now grasp and have a better understanding. And it's honestly a very complicated subject that is just so overlooked by people. And because it's overlooked, it really just doesn't explain just how much of a genius Abraham Lincoln was, diplomatically speaking, and how desperate of a situation the Confederates were in from the onset, and just how shaky their government was. Obviously, this video was not very well polished in terms of what I talked about. A lot of names like to escape me when I start talking about them. I don't really have a script, so I apologize for not having town names or whatnot. I would rather not say a name of a state or a town and get it wrong, and then I look like an even bigger idiot than just not saying it at all. But I will say that this is going to be a recurring thing in terms of just Civil War discussions. I moved to Tennessee, as you probably know from a lot of previous videos, if you've been keeping up with the channel, and because of that, I am in the middle of Civil War territory in terms of where the battlefields are and where armies move through. As such, I've been doing a lot more research and learning about the Civil War, and I want to talk about it more as it's a very interesting subject. It'll be mostly focused on the battles that happened and a lot of stuff that many people just don't know about the war, as well as some things that have to do with the Lighting the Powder Keg series. I'm going to be doing an episode about the American Civil War and the perception of the European powers of the American Civil War and how it changed their military doctrines and why we tend to just, again, oversimplify and overemphasize the importance of the Civil War on the formation of military technology and doctrine in Europe, and how they weren't stupid for ignoring most of the changes that the Americans had to deal with. Regardless, that's a whole other animal in itself. I do hope that I was able to bring to light some things that you might not have known and help explain certain aspects of the start of the American Civil War that you might not have thought of, or you might have just appreciate seeing a new perspective. If there's any information that I might have missed or something that you might want to bring up that isn't a lost causer argument, I'd love to hear it in the comments below. I am still learning more about the Civil War, so I'm not completely as well versed in it as I might be with World War I or European history, so I do appreciate all the feedback in the comments. I love receiving comments. Even the stuff that might not be the smartest is still very entertaining to me. So I appreciate everything that you guys as a community have brought to my channel. It's awesome. If you guys want to stay connected with the community, you can join the Discord in the link below, or follow me on Instagram, also linked in the description below. In fact, if you just look at the description, you will see a ton of different stuff that you can check out and take a look at if you want to get involved in the community and what I have growing here. If you've noticed, I do have my Wolf of 1918 coffee mug here. This is still the same day that I recorded the Adrian helmet video, so obviously things are going to be very similar. If you want to get one yourself, it is on my Teespring shop. Surprise, surprise, it's linked in the description below. Who would have thunk? If you want to get one, discount code somewhere on the screen if you do. I don't blame you if you don't, you know, for the 200 people who will eventually watch this video. So that is effectively the Civil War, how it began, and why, just the oversimplifications people do with the historiography of it. I appreciate everyone's support, and I hope to catch you in the next video. Auf Wiedersehen und tschüss, mein Kameraden.